More than 22,000 years ago, someone inside an Okinawan cave rubbed sea snail shell against sandstone. They kept grinding until the shell became a small curve with a sharp point. Place that object beside a modern fishing hook and the connection is immediate. The metal is different. The modern hook may have a barb, an eye, or a point turned inward, but the ancient idea is still there. That tiny curve would eventually become a Māori symbol of safe passage, support an English town where workers died young from sharpening it, and hang by the thousands from fishing lines stretching farther than some cities. The fishing hook did change. It became sharper, cheaper, stronger, and far more specialized. What never disappeared was the basic trick. When the fish pulls away, the curve makes escape harder. So how did one of humanity's smallest tools survive from the Ice Age to the Industrial Ocean? The story begins with something even simpler than a hook, a sharpened splinter designed to turn sideways. Before people bent hooks, they used a device known as a gorge. A gorge could be made from a thin piece of bone, shell, or wood. Both ends were sharpened, and the fishing line was tied around the middle. The fisher covered it with bait and left it straight. If a fish swallowed the bait, pulling the line turned the gorge sideways inside its mouth or throat. The two sharp ends became trapped. It was simple, and versions of it were used in many parts of the world. But it depended on the fish swallowing the bait deeply enough. A fish that only nibbled could take the food and leave the gorge behind. At some point, people began shaping the point into a curve. We do not know who did it first, and the idea may have appeared independently in more than one place. What we do have is physical evidence from Sakitari Cave in southern Okinawa. Archaeologists working inside the limestone cave found two hooks made from the shell of a sea snail. One was finished. The other appears to have been abandoned before it was complete. Nearby was a piece of sandstone with a smooth, worn area. It looked like the surface used to grind the shell. That combination makes the discovery feel unusually close. It is not only a finished object in the ground, it is a small workshop. The tool, the unfinished attempt, and the stone used to shape it. Charcoal from the same layer was dated to roughly 22,380 to 22,770 years ago. That makes the Sakitari hooks the oldest securely dated fish hooks yet discovered. The people who used the cave understood their island in detail. They returned during seasons when freshwater snails and crabs moved downstream. The cave also contained the remains of eels, frogs, birds, shell beads, and other tools made from marine material. On a place with limited stone, shell became technology. But an even older site, thousands of kilometers south, raises a harder question. Long before the Sakitari hook was made, people were bringing powerful open-water fish back to shore. How were Ice Age fishers reaching them? Jerimalai Cave sits on the eastern end of Timor, looking toward waters that drop quickly into the deep ocean. Inside the cave, archaeologists found fish bones dating back around 42,000 years. Many came from reef fish. Others belonged to tuna and similar fast-moving species associated with open water. That does not prove those early tuna were caught on hooks. People could have used nets, spears, traps, or methods that left nothing behind. A shell hook found at Jerimalai is much younger, dated somewhere between 16,000 and 23,000 years ago. But the bones still reveal something important. Open water fishing requires more than finding a sharp object. People needed some kind of boat or raft capable of moving beyond the reef. They needed knowledge of currents, weather, seasons, and the places where fish passed. They also needed a way to return while carrying a heavy animal that could fight with enormous force. That knowledge could not be invented again every morning. It had to be remembered, taught, and improved across generations. Timor gave people a strong reason to take that risk. Large land animals were scarce. The coast and open sea offered food that the island itself could not. Shell hooks from a broadly similar period have also been found in New Ireland, east of Papua New Guinea. Those discoveries do not tell us whether one community copied another or whether different groups reached the same solution. They do show that complex fishing technology was already present across a huge part of the Western Pacific during the Ice Age. The hook was never only a clever shape. It belonged to a larger system: boats, lines, knots, local knowledge, and trust between people who went onto the water together. In the Pacific, that relationship with the sea became so important that the hook moved beyond technology. It entered stories about where the land itself came from. In Māori tradition, New Zealand's North Island is not simply land surrounded by water. It is a fish pulled from the sea. The story centers on Māui, the youngest of several brothers. His older brothers considered him troublesome and refused to take him fishing. Māui responded by hiding in their canoe before they left. By the time they discovered him, turning back would have wasted the journey. Māui convinced them to paddle farther than usual. In many versions of the story, he carried a hook made from the jawbone of his grandmother, Murirangawenua. He lowered it into deep water, where it caught something far larger than any normal fish. Māui pulled until an enormous body of land rose from the ocean. The North Island is known in Māori tradition as Te Ika a Māui, the fish of Māui. A section of coast at Hawke's Bay is called Te Matawa Māui, the hook of Māui. The valleys and mountains are explained through what happened next. While Māui was away, his brothers began cutting greedily into the great fish. Their blows created the broken landscape. The hook survives outside the story as the He Matau, a carved pendant shaped like a fishhook. It can represent strength, prosperity, respect for the sea, and safe travel over water. Across Polynesia, real hooks were made in many forms, from shell, bone, wood, and combinations of materials. A large wooden body could be fitted with a bone point. Lure hooks could be decorated with bright shell that flashed underwater, attracting fish without ordinary bait. Shark hooks could be large enough to fill a person's hand. The forms differed because the fish differed. A hook for a small reef fish was not a hook for a shark. Materials, points, lures, and methods were shaped by local water and local prey. Some Hawaiian traditions also describe special power being attached to hooks made from human bone. The surviving accounts vary, and claims about exactly whose bones were chosen should be treated carefully. What matters is that the material of the hook could carry identity, status, memory, and spiritual meaning. For communities built around ocean travel, a hook could stand for far more than dinner. It connected skill, ancestry, danger, and return. Elsewhere, the same object followed a different path. Instead of becoming sacred, it became metal, standardized, traded, and written about. And one legendary fisherman deliberately removed the curve so his hook could catch a king. Shell and bone can hold a point, but both have limits. They can crack, wear down, or snap under strain. Metal changed what a hook could survive. Thousands of years ago, fishers began using copper and later bronze. Metal could be made thinner without becoming as fragile. It could be bent into a tighter curve, sharpened again after use, and produced in more consistent forms. Ancient Egypt gives us some of the clearest evidence because fishing appears repeatedly in tomb art and excavated objects. Early Egyptian metal hooks were often simple curves without the familiar eye at the top. The line could be secured around a thickened or folded end. Later examples added barbs, small backward-facing points that made a hook harder to remove once it entered the fish. The barb did not create the hook, but it changed the balance. A smooth hook could slip free when the line became loose. A barb gave the fisher more room for error. A market scene from a tomb at Saqqara, roughly 4,500 years old, appears to show fish hooks among other small metal goods. The hook was no longer only something a fisher made alone. It could be the product of a specialist and an object exchanged in a market. The Nile supported dozens of fish species, and Egyptian images show people using lines, nets, spears, and traps. There was no single fishing tool because there was no single kind of fish or water. More than 1,000 years later, Chinese tradition gave the hook a completely different purpose. Jiang Ziya is remembered as an elderly strategist who waited beside the Wei River. According to the legend, his line held no useful bait, and his hook was straight or suspended above the water. When people laughed, he explained that he was not waiting for a fish. He was waiting for a ruler who understood his value. King Wen of Zhou eventually came to meet him. Jiang Ziya became an advisor linked to the rise of the Zhou dynasty. The story produced a saying still used in different forms. When Jiang Taigong fishes, the willing take the hook. It describes someone entering a situation while understanding exactly what is being offered. Whether every detail happened as later tradition tells it is less important than the image that survived. A fisherman using a hook that cannot catch fish to attract the one person he actually wants. By then, the hook could be a tool, a market product, a symbol, and a metaphor. Its next transformation came when fishing itself changed. In England, wealthy people increasingly fished not because they needed food, but because they enjoyed the act. That created a new market. and an argument over who wrote its first major instruction book. In 1496, the English printer Wynkyn de Worde published A Treatyse of Fysshynge with an angle. It is the earliest known printed work in English devoted to recreational fishing. The book explains how to make rods and lines, which bait to use, and how different fish behave. It also gives rules about conduct. Do not trespass. Do not destroy another person's fishing place. Do not take so many fish that the water is left empty. Its instructions for hooks are extremely practical. Start with a steel sewing needle. Heat it, bend it into shape, and file in the point and barb. That advice reveals how closely the histories of needles and hooks would become. Both required straight wire, controlled heating, careful bending, hardening, and a point sharp enough to enter flesh with little pressure. The work was attributed to Dame Juliana Berners, usually described as a noblewoman and prioress connected with Sopwell. But the identity of the author remains uncertain. Records for Berners are thin. Her name appears in different forms, and historians have debated whether she wrote the fishing text, contributed to part of the larger book, or became attached to it through later printing. The mystery should not hide the book's importance. The treatise was printed again and again. By the end of the 16th century, it had reportedly appeared in at least 16 editions. Fishing was becoming an organized leisure culture, with written knowledge, expected behavior, specialist equipment, and customers willing to pay for quality. Isaac Walton's The Complete Angler, published in 1653, pushed that culture further. Angling became associated with patience, nature, conversation, and a particular image of English rural life. More anglers meant more demand for lines, needles, and hooks. Making those objects required the same concentrated metalworking skills. Much of that demand gathered around one town in Worcestershire. Redditch became famous for producing points fine enough to travel around the world. The people grinding those points often did not live long enough to grow old. Redditch became one of the world's great centers for needle and fishhook production. By the 19th century, local factories were sending enormous quantities of needles and hooks far beyond Britain. Industrial histories often credit the area with producing most of the world's needles at its peak. The work passed through many hands. Wire had to be drawn, cut, straightened, shaped, hardened, polished, and inspected. The most dangerous stage was pointing. A pointer sat close to a large grindstone spinning at high speed. Holding bundles of wire between his fingers, he pressed their ends against the stone until each became sharp. A skilled worker could point thousands of pieces in a short time. Every contact released dust from the metal and the grinding wheel directly in front of his face. The dust entered the lungs. Workers developed a disease known as pointer's rot. They suffered coughing, breathing problems, and gradual damage caused by inhaled particles. A physician warned the Medical Society of London about the death rate among pointers in 1796 and proposed a damp cloth or crepe covering to filter the air. The danger remained for decades. Accounts from the trade commonly describe pointers dying in their 30s. The exact life expectancy figures vary between sources and periods, but nobody inside the industry could pretend the occupation was safe. The grindstones added another risk. A stone spinning under pressure could crack or burst, throwing heavy fragments through the workshop. Pointers were often paid more than other workers because the job demanded speed and skill, and because its danger was obvious. Higher wages did not make the air safer. They simply placed a price on breathing it. Children also worked within the wider needle and hook industry. The town's pride, technical achievement, family income, and physical suffering all existed together. That is what makes Redditch important to the hook's history. The object looked small and simple because the complexity had been transferred into human hands. Its smooth curve and perfect point concealed repeated heating, grinding, polishing, and exposure. For a time, those trained hands gave Redditch an advantage few places could match. Then, in Norway, an engineer built a machine that could perform the sequence continuously. The hook stopped depending on one person's fingers, and production moved from thousands to numbers almost impossible to imagine. The company now known as Mustad began near Gjøvik, Norway, in 1832. It made nails, wire, and other metal goods. Fishing hooks were not the original plan. That changed in 1877 when engineer Matthias Topp developed an automated hook-making machine. Wire entered the process and emerged cut, bent, barbed, and pointed. Mustad chose not to patent the machine. A patent could have protected the invention, but it would also have published enough detail for competitors to study it. The company treated the process as a trade secret instead. Access was limited, and knowledge of the machinery stayed inside the business. Automation solved only one problem. A machine could make hooks quickly, but people around the world did not all want the same hook. Fish species differed, fishing methods differed, so did bait, water depth, local tradition, and the way lines were tied. Mustad's answer was to study the market in extraordinary detail. Company representatives gathered tens of thousands of hook patterns from different regions and brought them back to Norway. The factory could then manufacture cheaper, consistent versions for those same markets. This was not one design replacing every other design. It was industrial production learning to copy variety. The strategy worked. Mustad expanded through Europe, buying competitors and building factories. Some plants were prepared in Norway and then assembled elsewhere with machinery, knowledge, and trained workers sent together. By the middle of the 20th century, the company was reported to be making roughly half of the world's hooks. In some markets, the Mustad name became closely associated with the object itself. The company also produced items ranging from nails and paper clips to ovens and margarine. But the hook became its global signature. Redditch had depended on a dense community of specialists. Mustad turned much of that skill into a repeatable system. The result was not that the hook stopped changing. Manufacturers could now produce more sizes, materials, coatings, eyes, points, and curves than a hand workshop could manage. What changed most was scale. For most of human history, one hook meant one line, one fisher, and perhaps one fish. Industrial fishing broke that relationship. One line could now carry thousands of hooks and stretch across 60 miles of open ocean. At that scale, the ancient curve began catching animals nobody had intended to catch. A modern pelagic longline begins with one main line released behind a fishing vessel. It may extend for dozens of miles. Shorter branch lines hang from it at intervals, each carrying a baited hook. A single set can place thousands of hooks into the water. The method is designed for valuable open ocean fish, such as tuna and swordfish. It can cover an enormous area while the boat continues moving. But a baited hook cannot identify what is taking the bait. Sea turtles may swallow it or become hooked around the mouth. If a hook lodges deep inside the digestive system, removing it can be impossible. A turtle held below the surface may drown because it cannot return to breathe. Albatrosses and other seabirds attack the bait while the line is being set. They can become hooked and dragged underwater. Sharks, rays, juvenile fish, and species the crew never intended to catch may also come up with the line. The hook's strength has become part of the problem. It waits without needing power, fuel, or machinery at the point of capture. Multiply that efficiency by several thousand, and a simple device becomes an industrial net spread through open water. One response has been to change the hook again. Circle hooks bend the point inward toward the shank. Instead of catching deeply as soon as an animal bites, the hook is designed to move toward the edge of the mouth as the line tightens. In some fisheries, circle hooks combined with changes in bait have reduced serious injuries to sea turtles while still catching the target fish. Other measures help seabirds. Setting lines at night, adding weighted lines that sink faster, or using streamers that frighten birds away from the bait. None of these solutions works perfectly everywhere. Results vary by species, hook size, bait, fishing method, and location. A change that reduces turtle deaths may affect catches of sharks or rays. A safer hook is still one part of a much larger system. That brings the story back to the shell curve in Sakitari Cave. The ancient hook was shaped for one person trying to bring food home from local water. The modern hook may be almost the same size, but it now belongs to a machine, a market, and an ocean measured in thousands. The shape is familiar. The consequences are not. The fishing hook did not pass through 22,000 years without changing. It gained barbs and eyes. It moved from shell and bone to copper, bronze, iron, and steel. People built hooks for reefs, rivers, sharks, tuna, sport fishing, commercial fleets, and safer release. Some became lures. Some became pendants. Some were straightened on purpose because the person holding them wanted to catch a king instead of a fish. Yet all of those versions remain recognizably related. Why? Because the hook does something unusually useful with very little material. The line pulls in one direction. The curve redirects that force. The fish's attempt to escape helps move the point toward a place where it can hold. That principle is simple enough to carve from a shell and strong enough to survive in steel. But the history of the hook is not only a story of perfect design, it is a story of everything humans built around that design. The people at Jerimalai combined fishing tools with boats and knowledge of the open sea. Pacific cultures turned the hook into a symbol of ancestry and safe return. Egyptian metalworkers made it tradable. English books turned fishing into an organized leisure culture. Redditch sharpened the world's points while its workers breathed the dust. Mustad placed regional knowledge inside industrial machines. Longline fleets multiplied one hook into thousands. The curve stayed small while the system around it kept growing. Somewhere today, a child will feel a line pull for the first time and discover why this tool lasted. Somewhere else, a worker will release a longline into dark water before sunrise. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, someone may wear a carved hook not to catch anything, but to carry an old promise of strength and safe passage. That is the real achievement of the fishing hook. It did not remain frozen. It kept adapting without losing the idea at its center. If you enjoy discovering the hidden history inside ordinary objects, subscribe. There is another story every week. And tell me in the comments, what other tool feels so simple that it may already be close to its final form? 22,000 years later, we are still bending new purposes around the same ancient curve.